There are three types of Splunk deployments: single instance, distributed, and of course, Splunk in the cloud. No matter which deployment you use, Splunk performs the same three functions: data input, parsing and indexing, and searching. To scale your system, you can split this functionality across multiple specialized instances of Splunk Enterprise. That's right, no matter how large you scale, you are only ever installing Splunk Enterprise. You're just configuring it differently for different functions. There is one exception, and that is a universal forwarder. A universal forwarder is a very lightweight agent that sits on some machines and forwards data to your Splunk Enterprise instances. During the input phase, Splunk consumes the data from the sources, including forwarders. Splunk does not look at the data contents here. That happens during the next phase, which is parsing. Parsing happens on either an indexer or a heavy forwarder. Both an indexer and a heavy forwarder are simply installations of Splunk Enterprise configured in a particular way. During the parsing phase, Splunk examines, analyzes, and transforms the data. It identifies the timestamps, and it annotates the data with Splunk metadata. The next phase is indexing. In the indexing phase, Splunk takes the parsed data and writes it to indexes on disk in the form of flat files stored on the indexer in buckets. During the searching phase, Splunk manages all aspects of how the user interacts with the data. These are the physical components that make up a Splunk deployment. They can be configured to serve one of the three functions of Splunk that we just talked about: data input, parsing and indexing, and searching. There are only two different software packages you need to build any of these components, as I said: universal forwarders, and this is a specific light software package that has minimal configuration. And then everything else is a full version of Splunk Enterprise. You just configure it differently based on which function you want it to do. So let's take a look at three deployment scenarios. The first one is a departmental deployment. For a departmental deployment, we have a single search head that also serves as an indexer. So this is one Splunk Enterprise installation. It can be installed on Windows or Linux or in the cloud. In this scenario, we have up to 10 forwarders, either universal or heavy forwarders, forwarding data into our combined Splunk search head indexer. And this is appropriate for up to 10 users. The second scenario is a small enterprise deployment. In this deployment, we have a single independent search head, we have 2 to 3 load-balanced indexers, and we have up to 200 forwarders. Notice here that the search head and the indexers are separate Splunk Enterprise installations. The third type of deployment has nearly infinite scalability superpowers. In this configuration, we build search head clusters, indexer clusters, or both, and this allows for near boundless horizontal scalability. We can accommodate thousands of forwarders in this model. Here's what clustering does. An indexer cluster is a group of Splunk Enterprise indexers that are configured to replicate each other's data so that the system keeps multiple copies of all data. This process is known as index replication. By maintaining multiple identical copies of Splunk Enterprise data, the cluster prevents data loss while promoting data availability for searching. Splunk Enterprise clusters feature automatic failover from one indexer to the next. This means that if one or more indexers fail, incoming data continues to get indexed and indexed data continues to be searchable. A search head cluster is a group of search heads that serves as a central resource for searching. The search heads share knowledge objects, apps, and all other configurations. You can run the same searches, view the same dashboards, and access the same search results from any search head in the cluster. Notice something else here. We also have a deployment server or a deployer. The deployer is a Splunk Enterprise instance that you use to distribute apps and certain other configuration updates to the search head cluster members. The set of updates that the deployer distributes is called the configuration bundle. Let's talk about deploying Splunk in the cloud. Splunk Cloud has two major offerings. We have self-service, which is kind of limited to 20 gig of data ingestion, no Active Directory and single sign-on support, and 20 concurrent searches. A managed Splunk deployment in the cloud, however, is where you work with your Splunk representative to build out a custom deployment in Splunk Cloud using one of the deployment models that we talked about just a minute ago. How Splunk stores data. When Splunk processes raw data, it adds that data to indexes. Indexes are simply repositories for Splunk data. Splunk comes with a few indexes already built in, including one called main and one called _internal. As you can probably imagine, the _internal index is an index meant for storing Splunk internal logs. So incoming data comes in and Splunk transforms incoming data into what it calls events and stores those events in indexes. So we know what an index is now. It's simply a repository for Splunk data. And we need to know what an event is. An event is a single row of data. This single row of data has fields which are built in. They can be default fields. They can be fields that you specify using the field extractor. Fields are simply key value pairs. Username equals user123. That is a field. Splunk also adds default fields to all events. They are timestamp, host, source, and source type. The timestamp fields obviously adds a timestamp to each event. The host field is typically the host name or IP address of the source system. The source field is the name of the file, stream, or other input from which the event originates. And the source type is the format of the data. For example, if you look in that green box, that's an Apache log file, and it has a very specific format. And the source type for that is going to default to access_combined. That's just what the Apache log file source type is. Physically speaking, Splunk stores index data in buckets. In Splunk, an index contains compressed raw data and associated index files. These index files are spread out into different directories depending on their age. Splunk calls these directories buckets. There are 6 buckets, but only 5 of them are important for us to talk about. And they are hot, warm, cold, frozen, and thawed. The hot bucket contains newly indexed data. An index has one or more hot buckets. The warm bucket contains data rolled from the hot bucket with no active writing. An index has many warm buckets. The cold bucket contains data rolled from warm and moved into a different location. An index has many cold buckets. The thing to know about cold buckets is you specify a different physical location on the disk of where the cold bucket is stored. The frozen bucket is data that's rolled from cold. The indexer deletes frozen buckets by default, but you can choose to archive them first. And if you archive them and then have to retrieve the data, it goes into what's called a thawed bucket. And these are buckets restored from an archive. Here's where the buckets are in the file system. No matter if you're using Windows, Mac, or Linux, they're in the same location. And that is var lib splunk default db. And each bucket is a subdirectory. For example, in the hot path after the db/, we could have multiple hot buckets. Buckets have specific naming conventions, and we don't need to go into that here, but you can look at the Splunk docs for those naming conventions. Other things you can do with bucket. You can set a retirement and archiving policy. You can manually archive and restore from archives, remember the thawed bucket. You can back up your data. You can configure index sizes, and you can partition index data. Splunk Licensing. In Splunk, you license data ingested per day, not data stored. Daily indexing volume is measured from midnight to midnight by the clock on the license master. In addition to data stored, other things that do not count against your license are Splunk internal log data, duplicate data, and metadata. Splunk offers 7 different license types. First of all, we have the standard Splunk Enterprise license, and this is available through a Splunk representative, and you pay for different data consumption needs. So starting at 1 gig, you pay a certain amount of money to Splunk for certain data consumption per day needs. The enterprise trial license downloads and installs with the product. It's limited to 500 megabytes of ingestion per day. It's valid for 60 days, and then it converts into what's called the free license. The sales trial license is where a Splunk sales representative can customize the trial license for more volume or longer durations for a specific proof of concept that you're working on. A dev test license is restricted to non-production Splunk staging environments. The free license is perpetual and never expires, but it's highly restricted. It's restricted to 500 megabytes per day of data ingestion, and it has no login, no alerting, no distributed architecture, and a few other restrictions. The Industrial Internet of Things license is a specialized license for Internet of Things use cases. It gives you access to Splunk Enterprise and a specific set of Splunk Apps. The forwarder license allows a Splunk instance to be installed as a heavy forwarder. Starting with version 6.5, Splunk Enterprise no longer disables search when you exceed your licensed data ingestion quota. This is called the no enforcement policy. So here's what happens when you exceed your quotas. If you exceed your licensed daily volume on any one calendar day, you get a warning. If you get 5 or more warnings in a rolling 30-day period, you're in violation. If you're in violation, Splunk will continue to send messages, but it will not disable your search or any features. Splunk does this to allow for unexpected, temporary bursts of data volume. In a distributed environment, most Splunk Enterprise instances need access to an enterprise license. The exception is heavy forwarders, which only need a forwarder license unless they are also indexing data, in which case they need enterprise licenses. The ideal way is to set up a license master and have all of the Splunk instances in your environment talk to the master to get their licenses. A collection of licenses whose individual licensing volume amounts aggregate to serve as a single unified amount of indexing volume is called a stack. License pools are created from these license stacks. They're sized for specific purposes. The license manager manages license pools. Indexers and other Splunk Enterprise instances are assigned to a pool. Splunk recommends not assigning forwarders to a license pool since they have unique license types. Again, unless the heavy forwarder is also indexing data, then it needs the indexer type license, which is the Splunk Enterprise license. License groups are sets of license stacks. A stack can only be a member of one group, and only one group can be active at any given time. The groups are Enterprise Sales Trial, and these allow, of course, stacking of purchased enterprise licenses. Enterprise Trial is the default group that you get when you download Splunk, and you can't stack licenses on the Enterprise Trial. Free and forwarder licenses don't allow stacking. So here is how the whole architecture looks, and I have adopted this graphic from the Splunk documentation. So we have license groups as the big container, and then we have license stacks. And inside the license stacks, we have license files. These are the files you get when you purchase a Splunk license. And you can stack them so that they aggregate. And then from that aggregate, you can create a license pool, which you assign to specific instances. Welcome back. In this segment, I want to talk about Splunk Apps. And this is a really important topic. Apps extend Splunk's functionality. They're often written by vendors of products themselves, like HP or Cisco or F5. Individuals can also create apps, and other third-party organizations can create apps as well. You can find all the apps on splunkbase.com. And they do have tags. Some apps carry the Splunk Built tag, which means that app is built and certified by Splunk itself. And other apps carry the Splunk Certified tab, which means that Splunk has certified that app to work with the current version of Splunk. Some apps don't have any tags, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't download and try them. Some apps that have not yet become Splunk certified are still very, very good. What is an app? It's just a collection of configuration files. In other words, it's just a collection of text files. And apps also can have add-ons. And add-ons specify some more details about how the app behaves, including data collection and lookups and other extended things that apps can do. So an app is a collection of configuration files. An add-on is also a collection of configuration files, but add-ons and apps work together. As I said, you can get apps from splunkbase.com. Most apps are free, however there are a few premium apps. Currently there are 5 for which you'll need to buy a license. These include Splunk App for Enterprise Security, Splunk App for PCI Compliance, Splunk App for VMware, and Splunk App for Microsoft Exchange. Let's take a look at how to install and manage apps in Splunk. Back on our Windows 10 search head, let's open up the Splunk Web GUI. And here we are at the Splunk Web GUI. And we can see on the sidebar here, it says apps, and then it shows us the only app we have installed, which is the search and reporting app. Other apps that have GUIs built into them will appear on the side here. Some apps do not have GUIs, and most add-ons do not have GUIs. So how can we see and manage those kinds of apps? Well, we simply click on the gear here next to apps, and we see a list of all of the apps that we have installed. Currently I have 16 apps installed, and these are just the apps that come with a default installation of Splunk. Notice down here that we do have the Splunk Searching and Reporting app listed, because the Splunk Searching and Reporting app is actually an app. So now let's download a new app and install it. So we're going to go to Splunk Base, and we're going to simply search for an app that we think might be useful. And one of the best apps to start out with is called the Splunk Dashboard Examples. And there it is there. And we can see right off the bat that Splunk actually built this app, so it's highly trustworthy. We have some screenshots of what the app looks like once you install it. And we simply log in to download. Of course, we have to agree to the terms and conditions and all of that jazz. And we'll save it. And again, an app is just a series of configuration files. They're just text documents, so most apps are pretty light, and you can see how quickly this app downloaded. To install the app, click on the gear next to apps. Install app from file. Browse to the file we just downloaded. We don't need to unzip it or untar it or anything like that. And there it is. It's a TGZ. And I always like to tick this box here that says Upgrade App. This will ask Splunk to keep an eye on the app, and if there are any updates, alert us of those updates. Okay, the app was installed successfully, and we can see the app here. Is it visible? Yes, this means it has a GUI. It's enabled. We can launch app, edit properties, view objects, and view details on Splunk Apps. So viewing objects means viewing all of the knowledge objects that come with this app. It could be lookups, it could be data models, it could be tags, it could be event types or saved searches or dashboards. So since this app is visible, that means it will appear on our sidebar. Let's go back to the Splunk homepage. And there it is. Splunk 6.x dashboard examples. And what this app does is it takes the Splunk internal log information and gives you a bunch of ideas about dashboards you can make with that data. So if we click on charts, for example, we can see different examples of charts. This is a stacked chart. This is a regular column chart. Now let's take a look at the files that make up this app. As I said, apps are just a series of configuration files. So if we browse to the Splunk home directory, and we go to Etsy and apps, we can look at the folder, and this app is actually called Simple XML Examples. And we can look in the default directory and see all these conf files. So apps.conf saves searches, transforms, and visualizations. If we edit one of these or open it in Notepad, we can see the contents of this configuration file. And we'll go more deeply into configuration files in a different segment. You can also install apps through a command line interface, but whether you are on Windows or Linux, I recommend doing it through the Splunk GUI. And I thank you for joining me in this segment. I look forward to seeing you next time.